Hi class, in this video I'm going to be talking about loops in JavaScript, and we're going to be using them to add some scenery to our scenes that we created last week. So yeah, this will be a bit of a review from MMP 210, but I'm going to go over the basics just to make sure we're all on the same page. So to get started, we're going to use this as a way of adding some scenery to our scene. And loops are a convenient way to add multiple copies of something into a scene or to do something multiple times. To get started, I'm going to open up the GitHub desktop and just make sure everything's up to date. I'm going to switch into my MMP 310 and click fetch, just make sure I'm all good there. And then I'll click show in Finder, and I'm going to start off where we were last week. So we had project 1. Where we introduced our variables and our logic to move the character around the screen. So let's keep working. We'll continue to call this project 1. I'm just going to make a copy so that we don't lose the original project 1. So I'm going to, on the Mac, I'll hit Command D to duplicate. If you're on a PC, you can also just copy and paste. Either way, it will work. So I'm just going to call project 1 -1, and I'll call this project 1 -2. Whatever you want to use here, I'm just kind of going along. But the first thing that we're actually going to do is make a little bit of art here. So I'm going to open this up and just get it running. So I'm going to go to Sublime and open in Sublime Text. I'm going to go to GitHub and open in Sublime Text. And I'm going to make sure the Sublime server is running. So it's already running. And I'll just open a new window. Go to the project. And this thumbnail is broken because I changed the folder name here. So that's something to look out for. So I'll go to the index page and just update this. So this is project 1 -1. And that href is going to change as well. And so let's put in for project, for our next one, let's do project 1 -2. And I'll say, this is, our first one is project 1 character. And this is project number 1 setting. So we're going to add some elements into the scene to create a setting for our character. So let's go into here. And so we have our character there and ready to add some scenic elements. And so we're just going to add a few things to create sort of a scene for our character to walk around in. So instead of just making one big background image, like sometimes you might fill in like a whole background and, have like a mountain and a sun and stuff like that. That's good if you just want one still image, but we have this interactive scene where our character can move around. And so to create a background scenery that's going to, be more useful as we go out through the semester, what we need to do instead is create something that's repeatable. So I'm going to make some trees, and I'll use a loop to repeat these trees, inside my drawing. And I'll also make some clouds, and I'll use some different ways of distributing the clouds, but I need a loop. So a loop is basically anytime I want to repeat an action. So loop equals repetition. And that's something we do in code a lot. You're always trying to reuse your assets instead of just making a bunch of variables and stuff like that. So we'll kind of review how all of that works. But to start, I'm just going to make a quick drawing of a tree and a cloud to add into my scene. So I'm going to go to my Piskel editor and sign in. And remember, you guys can use Piskel. You can use other editors. You could use Photoshop or Illustrator if you have those, or if you have another preferred drawing or art. You could also, draw physical things on paper and then take photos of them and upload them. Whatever your preferred method is fine. So I'm going to go to my Piskel editor and create a couple new sprites. And so I'll just start with a tree. I'm just going to make some trees. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but just to get a couple things ready. So I'm going to get like a brown color for the tree trunk. And I'll just kind of draw the tree trunk like that. Maybe draw some roots and color this in a bit. I guess I can use the bucket tool. And maybe I'll make some lines on the, lines on the tree, give it a little detail. And then I'm gonna use a green color. I'll make this the secondary color so I can go back and forth. And just draw some leaves. And feel free to spend as much or as little time on these guys as you want. Okay, and maybe I'll actually make this a bit darker and just add a few details. Whatever you think looks good. I'm just gonna create a little tree. If you wanna make an animation with like some different tree movement, you can do that as well, but I'm just gonna leave this as is for now. So I'm gonna crop this down, and first I'll save it. So I'm gonna go to save and say tree 1. Save that to my gallery and then export. And since it's just a single image, I'm gonna use a PNG for this one instead of a GIF. So it'll be slightly better compression. So I'm gonna click download. I'm realizing now that it's very small, so I'm actually gonna scale that up a bit like that. Click download again. I can compare those. So there's my project. If I open up my downloads folder, there's one of my trees. That's good. This one is obviously too small, so I'm just gonna delete that. Just gonna rename this tree.png and throw this in here. So I have a tree, and let's make a cloud real quick. So I'm gonna save that and create another sprite. And so for this one, I'm gonna use like a white color, and maybe for the accent, I'll do something kind of light blue, so it's kind of like the sky. And so for the cloud, let's just draw kind of a cloud shape. And then maybe I'll just fill that in a bit. And then maybe I'll, draw some highlights in the cloud. Okay, and then let's just fill in these areas. So kind of a quick, rough cloud, but you guys can spend a bit more time on this if you want to make it look good. I'm going to crop that and save this as cloud. And then I'll just export. I'll leave the scale at 4, so it's a bit bigger. And let's take a look at that, cloud.png. Okay, so that looks good. I'm going to drag that over here as well. And so now I have a cloud and a tree to add into my scene. And for both of those, I'm going to use a loop. So I can make multiple copies of the image that I display in the scene. So I'm going to close the editor for now. I'm just going to exit out of here. And I'm just going to review how we create a loop. And then we'll add it into the scene. Let's go over to our code. I'm going to go to project 1-2 and go to sketch.js. And I'll increase this a little bit. So I'll start just by reviewing a loop. We are going to do the setting behind the character. So we have all this stuff going on for the character movement, and then eventually we draw the character down here. And we want the background obviously to be behind the character. You could maybe put the trees in front if you wanted to have the character walk through the trees. But for now, I'm just going to put everything in the background. So I'm going to put a little comment here that says setting. For now, I'm just going to draw some circles just to get a sense of what this looks like. So a loop is basically just a control structure like any other control structure. So I'll put a comment that says loop here. And so you can see we have these if statements down here. And a loop pretty much works the same way, but there's just a few extra components that go into it. So for example, if we wanted to draw a cloud, if I said if, and then let's say we wanted to draw, as many clouds as fit 5 times in the screen. So I would start out with a counter. So I could say like variable cloud counter, and we'll set that at 0. And so then I'll say if 0 is less than 5, that's the number of clouds we want. Then let's draw a cloud. So for now, I'm just going to draw an ellipse, and I'm going to draw it at 100, 100, 100. Okay, I'll save that and reload my scene. Okay, so there's my ellipse. Okay, so if I say if 0 is less than 5, then we're going to draw that ellipse once because 0 is less than 5. And so the ellipse, we draw the ellipse, but we only draw one. If we want to draw more, what we have to do is change this condition until it's no longer true. Okay, so there's a couple things that we would need to change here. So instead of using just 0, I can use my cloud counter, and I can throw that in there. And then I need to increase my cloud counter. So I would say, cloud counter plus equals 1. So it would go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let's use a text box just to visualize this. So I'm going to say cloud counter, and we're going to put it in the same place as the ellipse. And one thing that we'll see is that we still just have a 1 here, okay, because we're still just using the if statement. And so what I'm going to change here is I'm going to change if into while. So we go from having an if statement or a condition, which just makes a decision one way or another, to a while loop, which actually keeps going as long as this condition is true. So while the cloud counter is less than 5, we're going to keep going. And it's very important that we change the cloud counter, because otherwise we'd get what's called a stack overflow, where if we don't eventually make this cloud counter greater than 5, what will happen is that it'll never stop counting, and so it'll never get out of this statement. It'll just keep looping around and around, and it'll crash the browser. So now if we reload, you can see this number is 5, but we only see one cloud. We only see one circle here because we're drawing them all in the same place. So that's another thing we have to do, is change something about where we draw the ellipse. And so since I have the cloud counter, I could say, 100 plus cloud counter. So you can see now there's like a little bit of difference. We can see there's like, that edge there, but that's not enough to really get 5 different clouds. So what we would need to do is maybe multiply this by like 50 or something like that. So now we're getting a bunch of different clouds. And so that's basically how a loop works. The while loop is not, typically what we use, but I just wanted to use it to demonstrate that it's really not that different from a conditional statement or other types of code that we've already seen. What we normally use is a for loop. And so let's go over what a for loop looks like. So it's basically the same thing, except we move all the conditions into our parentheses here. So with a for loop, I start with the keyword for, and just like an if statement or a while statement, I have my condition, and then I have the code that I want to do here. And so the initial statement is where we start counting. So I'm going to copy that and put it down here. Then we have the ending statement or the conditional. So as long as this statement is true, we keep looping through our code. So I'm going to take this and put it down here. Then we need one more semicolon, and then we have the incrementing condition, so we can put that here and go right here. And I don't need that semicolon at the end. And then I'm just going to put the code that I want to run in here. So the for loop, it looks very long here, mostly because my cloud counter variable is so long. But now I can just delete the rest of this stuff. And now we have our clouds. And the more I change between each cloud, the more distance there is between the clouds. So I can repeat drawing that cloud, but only using this one ellipse. So that's one way to draw, to use a for loop, is just by starting at 0 and counting as much as we want. Another way to do it, if we want like an even distribution across the page, is to actually take into account the X area of our canvas. So that's another way that I can set up my loop. So I'll leave the cloud counter as is, but I'll do this with our trees. So before I do that, let's actually add in our graphics now that we've kind of reviewed how the loop works. So I'm going to go back up to my global variables. And that's my character. So I'm just going to add my tree image and my cloud image here. And I'm going to preload those. So pretty much the same thing as what I've got here. I've got tree image equals load image, and then I just have tree.png. Let me just double check. That's what I called it. Yeah. So I have tree.png, And then I have cloud image equals load image cloud.png. And so now instead of just drawing an ellipse here, I'm going to draw an image of the cloud image. Actually, let me just write this from scratch. So I have an image function now instead of the ellipse. The image I want to draw is the cloud image. And we want to draw it at the cloud counter times 100. And for the y value, let's just use 100 still. Okay, so there's my clouds. If I want more separation, I can increase that. Okay, so now I have my clouds up there. So let's do the trees and then we'll make some variations. So for my clouds, I started with just the number of clouds I wanted, which was 5. And then I used a counter. So I started at 0 and I increased by 1. So I just count from 0 up to 5. And for each count, I draw another cloud. And because I did that, I have to use the cloud counter to change something about the parameters of the image so that we see them being drawn in different places. For my trees, I can do the same thing, but in this case, instead of using a counter, I'll use the value x starting over here and going to here. So I'm still gonna have a for loop. I'm still gonna have a bunch of conditions, and I'm still gonna have my code scope over here with my brackets. But now, instead of starting with the cloud counter, I'm going to start with the value x. And in this case, instead of using var is totally fine in this case because I only have one cloud counter. But here, I'm actually going to use let x. And so this is something that I might have talked about before or I may not. But it's basically the same thing as var, except you'll see the difference is with var, it creates this variable that exists for the rest of the program, whereas with x, it only creates a variable that's scoped to stay inside of this for loop. And so I'll show you what that means in a second. But basically, this way, if I want to use x again in the future, I don't have to worry about overwriting or reusing this x variable. So I'm going to say let x, and I'm going to start on the left side of the canvas over here and say it's 0. And then I'm going to say x is less than width. So one of the nice things here is that I know exactly how far it is from here to here by using the width variable. I don't have to think about how many trees I want. I just use width and I know it's going to go across the canvas. And then the last value is how much I want to go up each time. And so that will change the distribution of the trees. So that's basically like the 150 that I have up here that sets 150 between each cloud. In this case, it's going to tell me how many trees I have. So I could say 100 and see what that looks like. And so this one looks much simpler, mostly because x is a smaller variable, and instead of using a hard-coded 5 here, we're using the width here. So now I can have an image and say it's the tree image, and then here I can just use x. So it's the same value here. I don't have to change it. And then for the y value, let's just do something down here. So the height of our canvas is 480. So maybe we'll start at 400 and see what that looks like. Okay, so there's our trees. So that looks pretty decent. If I want the trees to be farther apart, I would increase this number. Okay, if I want them to be closer together, then I can decrease that number. So this x plus equals is the change in x between each loop. So if it's smaller, then there's more trees because they're closer together. If it's larger, then there's fewer trees because they're farther apart. And so I can show you the difference between var and let now. So if I go down here and I say console.log cloud counter, what happens is it's 5 because it counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when I use var, this variable is going to exist inside of the rest of the draw function. However, if I say console.log x, okay, so it's same thing, for loop let x versus for loop var cloud counter. Now I'm going to get an error. X is not defined. Let me increase that a bit. So x is not defined because when I use let, that means it only exists in between here and here. So technically that's a better variable declaration for a for loop than var. So let's get rid of those. So we have our trees, we have our clouds. If we walk around with the character, you can see that the character goes in front of the trees, on top of the clouds. I guess it doesn't really make sense to have trees and clouds if the character can just walk around wherever they want. But you guys can add whatever you want into your scene. If I wanted the trees to be on top of the character or the clouds, what I could do is just move this down here. So now the character will go behind the trees. So it's just with P5, it just draws, you know, stuff that comes later in the program. After, I could also have like 2 rows of trees. So maybe these trees are a little bit higher and the character goes in front of those, but behind these guys. So I can create some kind of fake depth there. So, you know, if you want to make multiple versions of the loop, you can do that. Another thing that you can do is do more than one drawing of the image. So I could take this one, make another one, you know, offset X a bit and offset Y a bit. And now I have like a bunch more trees. Maybe now I want to separate them out a little bit more. Okay, so I can start to create a lot of different variations just with the math inside of my loop. Same thing with the clouds. I can repeat this loop if I want the clouds to go on top, but if I just want more clouds, I can just copy the image function here and make more clouds. You know, maybe I'll push them down a bit so they're not on the same plane, and maybe I'll change this value so they're separated differently. Let's try 200 then. Or maybe 175 or 250. Let's see. Okay, that's okay. Maybe we'll move them down a bit more. So we can kind of move them around till we get what we like. Oh, I can see the issue here is this is multiplying. So let's do like 125, see what that looks like. And then I can also add to the beginning of this or the end. So maybe I can offset it there a bit. Anyway, I can play around with those values until I get more of a setting that I want. And the nice thing about these loops is that I don't have to draw this image. See, now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 clouds, but I only did cloud image call twice, and I used the loop to do everything else. Down here, I used one for loop for the background trees, and I used another for loop down here for the foreground trees. So let me put a little comment here that says foreground. So I have the background setting and the foreground. So there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of mix these things around with different loops and different settings to add a lot of different graphics and set up the graphics in different ways. So that's it for this video. In the next video, I'm going to cover a new topic, which is the array. And you usually see arrays and loops used together. And so it's a good chance to cover a new topic and relate it to what we just saw with this topic.